What if I told you that the second biggest driver of climate change isn't power plants, heavy industry, or a fleet of cargo ships? It's a cow. Not just one cow, about 1 billion of them. Plus the rice paddies, fertiliser, and the forests we cleared to make room for all of it. The global food system is responsible for up to 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. That's a big claim, I know, and I will explain in a minute. But unlike energy or transport, where the solutions are mostly known, agriculture is a genuinely hard engineering problem because the emissions are biological, distributed, and messy, and because 8 billion people need to eat. Farming is one of the oldest human activities. Humans have been cultivating the earth to grow food for over 10,000 years. But today's agriculture is industrialized, globalized, and optimized for the yield of monoculture crops. Besides not always leading to the healthiest food choices, that design comes with a massive hidden cost: climate change. In today's video, we're talking cow burps, fertilizer, rice paddies, and the complex engineering challenge of feeding Earth's 8 billion people without boiling the planet along the way. I'm Rosie Barnes, founder of Partalute Consulting, where we advise on clean energy technologies, helping startups with development and investors with assessing the landscape. Welcome to Engineering with Rosie. Let's start with the obvious question. How much does agriculture contribute to climate change? I said up to 1/3 of emissions at the start of the video, and really the answer depends on exactly what you include. If we look strictly at emissions from farms, which are often called farm gate emissions, agriculture contributes roughly 11 to 13% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But that's really only part of the story. If the scope includes land use changes, like deforestation of farmland, and the wider food system, which includes making pesticides, food processing, packaging, transporting, retail, and the way people use food at home, that number jumps to nearly 30% of global emissions. That means the sandwich that you're eating for lunch might be as much of a climate problem as the car you drove to work. You're probably already aware that when it comes to agriculture, carbon dioxide is not the only greenhouse gas we need to worry about. In fact, CO2 is not even the main issue when it comes to our food sources. The real culprits are methane and nitrous oxide. Methane comes from farm animals produced during digestion. Nitrous oxide comes from the soil, released when nitrogen fertilizers are applied. And with agriculture responsible for 42% of global methane emissions and 67% of global nitrous oxide emissions, it punches well above its weight in terms of climate impact. Now let's deconstruct exactly where agricultural emissions come from, because agricultural emissions is not one thing. It's a collection of biological, chemical, and pre- and post-production processes in industry, many of which are surprisingly messy. And because those processes are messy, there is an inherent loss of control that makes agricultural systems difficult to manage in terms of climate impacts. Let's look at the top 5 contributors to agricultural emissions. Let's just get it over with and start with cow farts. When ruminant animals like cows, sheep, and goats digest food, microbes in their stomachs produce methane. And that methane gets released as, well, gas. This is a natural process called enteric fermentation. Despite the common misconception, the problem isn't cow farts, it's cow burps. It's all about where methane is produced. Cows and the like have a multi-chambered stomach, and the key chamber is called the rumen. The rumen is essentially a giant fermentation tank where microbes break down plant material and produce methane as a byproduct. If you think of a cow as a fermentation reactor, with the rumen as the reactive vessel and methane as the waste gas, the cow itself becomes the pressure release system, with its primary release valve at the top, not at the bottom. So 90% of methane from cattle is released through burping. Slightly less funny and way less stinky than cow farts, but much more important in the agriculture climate equation. Cow burps alone account for up to 30% of global anthropogenic methane emissions. And methane, while short-lived, is extremely powerful as a greenhouse gas. Over 20 years, it's about 80 times more potent than CO2. So yes, cow burps are a big climate problem, scientifically speaking. To fix our cow burp problem, we don't start with the burps, we also don't start with the cows, we start with us. We can improve our cows' diets with improved grass species and additives that break down the methane in the cow's gut and intestines before it escapes, a BINO digestive enzyme for cows. CalBurp Beano is a simple but highly impactful solution because it essentially reprograms digestion by inhibiting the microbes that produce methane in the animal's gut. Compounds like 3-NOP and seaweed-derived bromoform can reduce methane emissions, typically by around 20 to 40%, with even higher reductions reported under controlled conditions. Essentially, the easier the cow's food is to digest, the less methane the cow produces. So, improving feed quality is about improving methane intensity or lowering emissions per burger. Beyond what cows eat, where and how they eat also matters. Healthier pastures means more digestible feed and less methane per mouthful for the cow. Rotational grazing or paddock systems, as well as reducing herd density by giving cows more space to live and breathe and feed, are all emerging best practices that can help solve our CalBurp problem. Though, one caveat is that lower herd densities means you need more grazing land, and the topic of land use is one I'll come back to. Good grazing management can improve soil carbon storage, increase productivity per hectare, and reduce fertiliser use. These solutions are a net positive for emissions and farming too. After our cows and other ruminant animals finish digesting, the emissions keep coming in large amounts of manure or poo, which, when stored in poo lagoons or poo piles, decompose anaerobically, producing even more methane. So, we have CalBurps and manure. But how much poo are we pondering? Globally, livestock produces billions of tonnes of manure every year. A single cow can produce tens of tonnes of manure annually. That's close to 150 humans combined. When you multiply that number by over 1 billion cattle globally and consider that a tonne of manure can create between 16 and 84 kilograms of CO2 equivalent during storage and up to 24 kilos of CO2e if it's applied to fields, you can start to see the scale of the problem. Manure management can account for roughly a third of emissions on some dairy farms. In terms of nutrients, animal manure is not all bad. It enriches the soil with macronutrients in the form of potassium, phosphorus, and nitrogen, adding roughly the same amount of nitrogen to agriculture as synthetic fertilisers do. The problem with cow manure as a natural fertiliser is a lack of control. I think it's interesting to contrast how we dispose of cow manure compared to human waste. In contrast to cow manure, disposing of human waste is one of the most engineered systems we've built. Human poo is collected, transported, treated, and monitored. We know where it is, we control what happens to it. Applying a similar level of control to the messiness of cow manure is one of the areas where engineering solutions can have the most impact in agriculture. If we start treating cow manure more like human poo by capturing it and managing it, we can stop emissions from leaking into the atmosphere and pollution into waterways. And we can also better leverage it as a valuable fertiliser. Anaerobic digestive systems can be used to capture and break down manure while producing methane biogas that can be used as a renewable energy source. In the US alone, digesters process manure from 1.5 million cows, keeping the equivalent of 7.2 million tonnes of CO2 from entering the atmosphere each year. I visited a piggery last year that had covered poo lagoons and a brand new gas treatment system which powered second-hand Ford Falcon motors, driving generators to power farm operations. These kinds of systems don't capture all methane, and the cost-benefit equation is usually not favourable for small to medium farms. So there are limitations, but it's definitely a big improvement over status quo. For all the Australians watching, you're probably thinking the same thing as I usually do. Does this apply to free-range cows? Because we don't have feedlot cows in Australia. So I always feel like this information that I hear about beef and climate change just doesn't apply here. But is free-range better or worse for the climate? It's much harder/impossible to capture the poo of free-range cattle. It's spread across vast land areas. And while they have more access to unfertilised, untransported grass, climate wins, that is unfortunately outweighed by the slower weight gain and longer lives. Free-range cows just spend more time burping along the path to becoming sausage sizzles, which is actually an overall climate loss. So far, we've talked about livestock burps and manure as top contributors to agricultural climate change emissions. But meat isn't even our main food source. In fact, plants account for 80% of the food humans eat globally, with roughly 60% of human caloric intake coming from 3 crops alone: rice, corn, and wheat. And to grow all our staple grains and big leafy greens, we need fertiliser. Hence, we arrive at the third big contributor to agricultural climate emissions: synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. Fertilizers are responsible for emissions during two phases, production and application. On average, they produce 10.5 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of nitrogen used, with application accounting for 2/3 of that footprint. Over half of the world's synthetic fertilizers are produced using the Haber-Bosch process, a highly energy and carbon-intensive chemical process that relies on natural gas. In the process, ammonia is synthesized by reacting nitrogen from the air with hydrogen, typically derived from natural gas, at high pressures and temperatures over an iron catalyst. Then there's the application. Only a fraction of the nitrogen actually gets used by plants when synthetic fertilizers are applied to the soil. In fact, 40 to 60% of nitrogen inputs are lost to the environment. Microbes in the soil convert excess nitrogen into nitrous oxide through processes such as denitrification. And you need to remember that nitrous oxide is 273 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. Altogether, fertilizers account for roughly 2% of global emissions, about the same as all of aviation or all of shipping. While making synthetic fertilizers is a highly controlled process, once it hits the soil, it is not so different from manure. It gets messy and variable, decentralized and hard to manage. To tackle fertilizer emissions, agriculture is moving toward precision nutrient management. The goal is simple: match nitrogen supply to plant demand, which reduces waste and emissions. Together with improvements in soil health, controlled release fertilizers, and better crop varieties, we can reduce agricultural nitrous oxide emissions substantially. Up to this point, we've looked at three major sources of agricultural climate emissions: cow burps, cow poo, and synthetic fertilizers. But even if you stopped eating meat entirely and only ate organic, unfertilized plants, the rice in your bowl can still pose a problem for the climate. Rice usually grows in controlled wetlands called paddies. Most are centralized in Asia, which accounts for nearly 90% of global rice production. The largest and most widespread paddy area is in India, with China in close second place. Other major rice-growing regions include Bangladesh, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand. So, what's my beef with rice paddies? The problem with rice paddies is that flooded soils create oxygen-poor conditions, which are ideal for methane-producing microbes to flourish. These happy-go-lucky microbes produce 30 million tonnes of methane annually, which accounts for a staggering 1.5% of global emissions, aka as much as cement. And that's from rice paddies alone. Other paludiculture crops, such as palms for oil, grow in wet or flooded conditions, contributing to this problem. There are alternative farming methods for these crops that could reduce the problem, but the practical challenge is with adaptation, since these crops tend to be farmed by smallholders using traditional methods. So if you are thinking of swapping your hamburger for a sushi roll to reduce your climate impact, you may need to consider a different choice. Now, there's one more agricultural emissions offender, an elephant in the room, or should I say, elephant in the forest, and that's land use change or deforestation. To put it simply, forests are cleared to create pasture or cropland, which releases massive amounts of carbon, which was previously stored in the trees and the soil. Deforestation is a particularly big problem in beef production, also soy, which is often used for animal feed, and shrimp farming, which destroys carbon-rich mangroves. And these make up over 20% of emissions attributable to agriculture. Now that we've looked at creative ways to solve our cow burps, manure, and fertilizer emissions problems, we're ready to move into some deeper engineering territory. Just like every other industry today, modern agriculture is becoming increasingly data-driven. With the use of sensors, satellites, drones, and machine learning, farmers today are optimizing water use, fertilizer application, and crop yields. We mentioned precision agriculture as an emerging data-driven farming managing strategy that uses technology to optimize field-level inputs on a per-plant or site-specific basis. It is incredibly powerful, but there's a catch. It requires data. And right now, agricultural data is fragmented, inconsistent, and often inaccessible. So technology exists, but scaling it remains a challenge for now. What about more radical change? Organic and regenerative farming systems improve soil health, increase carbon sequestration, and reduce chemical inputs. But they often yield around 20 to 25% less on average. And lower yields means more land is needed, leading to more deforestation. So while organic and regenerative farming systems are environmentally beneficial, they're not necessarily a climate solution. Then we have vertical farming and sci-fi salad growing in sleek white towers. But vertically grown food is incredibly expensive and energy intensive. Again, not actually a climate solution. We also have soil carbon sequestration or carbon farming, the process of capturing atmospheric carbon dioxide through photosynthesis and storing it in the soil as soil organic carbon, which is often presented as a big climate solution. And it does have big potential. However, soils have a limited and variable capacity to store carbon and can re-release it after it's been trapped. It needs to be monitored very closely on a site-by-site basis. Qualitatively, it definitely works, but quantifying it is incredibly challenging. I'm traveling at the moment, and like most people these days, that means I'm relying on connected devices, online services, and cloud-based apps almost constantly. Whether it's agriculture, energy, or manufacturing, digital technology is generating vast amounts of data. Today's farms generate information through sensors, drones, connected equipment, and cloud-based software. And more broadly, we're all sharing increased amounts of information online. In fact, Australia has already passed age verification laws, and around the world, we're seeing more platforms asking for your ID, your face, or your phone number just to access online services. Today's video is sponsored by Obscura VPN. Most VPNs ask you to trust them with your internet activity. Obscura takes a different approach. Traditional VPNs can see both who you are and the websites you visit. Obscura is designed so that it cryptographically can't link your identity with your internet activity. And their protocol blends your traffic in with the rest of the internet so you don't get blocked. Obscura is open source. That means the code and infrastructure can be independently inspected rather than relying on marketing claims. It also includes configurable ad and tracker blocking, giving you more control over how much information websites can collect about you. And unlike many online services, Obscura is a company focused on privacy. You don't even need to provide a personal email address to sign up. If you'd like to check it out, go to obscura.com/Rosie or scan the QR code on screen to get 25% off a subscription. That's obscura.com/Rosie or use code Rosie at the checkout. Now we've talked about all these solutions, what's holding us back? If all these solutions exist, then why aren't we seeing change occur more rapidly? Well, first thing, the economics are tough. Farmers tend to operate on razor-thin margins. Switching systems costs money, increases risk, and potentially reduces yields compared with current big agriculture monoculture farming. Farmers can be risk-averse and often depend on incentives to innovate or change to new systems. This makes the systems we've discussed today difficult to adopt on a wide scale, which means adoption is slow. Only big commercial farms, mostly in the US and Europe, are ready and able to adopt high-tech, future-forward solutions. Farms in many other parts of the world are small and use more traditional farming methods. We also face a problem of scale. We're talking about feeding 8 billion people. The solutions we create need to work globally and scale across climates and farming systems. That's a huge engineering challenge. Every solution comes with trade-offs. Lower emissions versus lower yields. Efficiency versus cost. Technology versus accessibility. There's no perfect option, only better compromises that do the most good or least harm. The same applies to individual choices. Eliminating animal products from your diet will probably lower your personal emissions. But a compromise where you cut out the high emissions foods that you don't like that much, while keeping the ones that you do, is a whole lot better than nothing. I once heard someone say that 2 half-time vegans is equivalent to 1 full-time one as far as the climate is concerned. And I think that's a good way to think about it. So that's my take on agriculture. This is actually a video I've been planning for years, but a tricky one because there's so many different aspects to it that keeping it tight and simple enough for a catchy YouTube video was very hard. I don't know how well I succeeded at that. It still was very long and fragmented, and I left many important things out, as I'm sure you will tell me in the comments, and please don't hold back. That really boosts engagement and tells the YouTube algorithm you think this video is great. We know what the challenge is: producing food with fewer emissions, less land, and less waste for a population that keeps growing. This is an engineering problem, a systems problem, one of the genuinely hard ones. And it's worth paying attention to because no matter what else changes in the energy transition, everyone still needs to eat. Thanks to Obscura and Henson Shaving for supporting today's video. These videos take a lot of work to make properly. The research, the fact-checking, the writing, the time to explain things the way they deserve to be explained. If you want to make sure I can keep on doing that, consider becoming a member on Patreon or YouTube. You'll get early access to new videos, an exclusive Engineering with Rosie Discord server, plus community posts, and a say in future topics. But most members are really just here because they want to keep this kind of content existing. If that sounds like you, then we'd love to have you along. You can sign up at this link. Now, I know what you're thinking, Rosie, why are you holding a razor? Well, it's because I appreciate excellent engineering whenever I see it. Here's something odd. Modern razors keep adding more blades, pivots, springs, lubrication strips. All these extras that are supposed to make shaving smoother. But once the hair is cut, every extra blade is mostly just creating more friction, which is a bit like a lot of the agricultural systems we've talked about today. Instead of fixing the root problem, you keep on adding layers to compensate for it. More inputs, more complexity, more things to manage. Henson Shaving took the opposite approach. One blade held at the ideal angle, precision machined for a cleaner, smoother shave with less irritation. Good design isn't about adding more, it's about controlling what matters. Today's video has been sponsored by Henson Shaving. Use my link below or scan the QR code to check them out. Use the code ENGINEERINGWITHROSIE to receive 100 free blades with the purchase of a razor.